yourself. Awesome. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed your lunch or cocoa van. Personally, I could have bathed in that gravy. I still might. We'll see if there's time at the end of the day. As you can see, our panel is joined us on stage, and this panel has been sponsored by the good people at the Cement Association of Canada. Now, their new CEO sadly couldn't join us in Calgary today. However, it is the 21st century, so with the benefit of technology, he's able to make the introductions from the comfort of his home. Ladies and gentlemen, please turn your attention to the screens and welcome Cement Association of Canada's CEO, Adam Auer.
Good afternoon. My name is Adam Auer, and I'm the new president and CEO of the Cement Association of Canada, taking over from Michael McSweeney, who's retiring on June 30th. I know many of you know Michael well and share my gratitude for his 15 years of strong leadership at the CAC and best wishes for a long and well-deserved retirement. I'm very sorry not to be able to join you in person today, but I appreciate the opportunity to share a few words virtually before introducing our next panel session. First, I'd like to congratulate Relaunch Alberta and, of course, New West Public Affairs for bringing together so many leaders from across the political spectrum to talk about the most critical issues facing us all. The focus of the following session, Pathways to Net Zero, is at the top of the cement and concrete sector's priority list. Over the last decade, Michael, our team, and I have worked hard here in Alberta to educate and advocate on the economic and environmental benefits of cement and concrete. And indeed, concrete is the world's most important building material. In fact, it is the most consumed material on the planet after water. It's in our buildings, our bridges, sidewalks, and subways, and of course plays an essential role in the energy sector, from oil and gas to renewables. But making the cement that holds concrete together produces a lot of carbon. 1.5% of Canada's emissions come from the cement sector, and that number jumps to 7% on a global basis. We know that net zero cement and concrete is possible, and in fact, we have a roadmap to guide us there by 2050, including a goal to reduce up to 40% of our emissions by 2030. But one thing that our roadmap makes abundantly clear is that we cannot do it alone. We will need all levels of government to create the regulatory and fiscal frameworks needed to foster innovation and spur investments in the technology needed for heavy industries such as ours to have a fighting chance to succeed. Alberta's bold climate change leadership on carbon capture and sequestration technologies is a perfect example of this, and now is finally being met with an emerging constellation of federal supports like the Net Zero Accelerator, Investment Tax Credit, and Carbon Contracts for Difference. And as major players in the construction market, we also need governments to make low carbon decision making a core consideration of infrastructure and related procurement decisions. In essence, we need to be open, honest, and comprehensive about what it's going to take for Canada to reach net zero by 2050. And I know that's exactly what today's panelists are going to do. So without further delay, let me introduce our moderator and panelists. First, Ed Whittingham will be the panel moderator. Ed is a prominent Canadian environmentalist known to many of you. He is the former executive director of the Pembina Institute, a past board director of the Alberta Energy Regulator, and a past member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on the Future of Oil and Gas. His op-eds have been published in newspapers and magazines across Canada and globally. Sarah Marshall is Vice President of Sustainability at Nova Chemicals and a leading expert on the plastic circular economy, industrial decarbonization, and broader sustainability issues. In her current role, she is responsible for leading Nova Chemicals' long-term ESG strategy. Maria Hushovd is a managing director at RBC Capital Markets and leads the ESG credit group within corporate banking. In her current role, Maria is responsible for integrating ESG considerations and strategy into all facets of the corporate loan book and works with internal partners across the RBC platform to ensure a coordinated approach to ESG. Kevin Krausert is the CEO and co-founder of Avatar Innovations, a groundbreaking energy innovation investment firm. Kevin has spent 20 years on the front lines of energy innovation in numerous executive leadership and governance roles in the oil and gas industry. And last but not least, Mark Cameron is Vice President for External Relations with the Oil Sands Pathways Alliance to Net Zero. And prior to joining the Alliance, Mark was Deputy Minister of the Policy Coordination Office in the Government of Alberta. Mark has 3 decades of experience in public service, business, and consulting. So we know there's a lot of work to be done. I know you are all up to the challenge, and so are we. I look forward to hearing what our amazing panelists have to say, and to working with all of you to build the sustainable world of tomorrow. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Ed Whittingham, and thanks to my friend Adam Auer and the Cement Association for sponsoring what will be the wonkiest panel of the day. So if a deep dive on decarbonization and net zero is your thing, you're at the right panel. If not, you've got an hour until Mark Carney takes the stage. Vote with your feet. So we know the Government of Canada is committed to Canada on a path to net zero by 2050. I always like to think of net zero, the analogy being like a bathtub. And the bathtub's the atmosphere, and water filling the bathtub is the CO2. So a little bit of water in the bathtub is fine, but if the water overflows the bathtub, then you can wreck the house. So we have to do a couple things. One, we need to slow the flow of the water in the bathtub. But even a slow trickle will still cause the water to spill the tub and wreck the house. So then we actually have to think of how can we drain part of the bathtub. Slowing the water is reducing emissions. Draining part of the bathtub is carbon removal, which is essentially taking carbon from the air and moving it down into rocks, trees, the oceans, what have you. And when you get a safe level between new water coming in to the bathtub and water draining out, then that's the net zero part, and that's what we're striving to do. So the Government of Canada has made that commitment. It's also made a commitment to capping emissions in the oil and gas sector. It's a live conversation. It's made a commitment to a clean fuel regulation, which has a huge impact on the oil and gas sector. As of today, it looks like it'll be delayed by a year. What is the impact of net zero on our energy sector? What is the impact on the province? We know it's going to be huge, and we know on the pathway to net zero, CCUS will be in the mix, as Adam said. We know that hydrogen will. We know that energy efficiency will be part of it, and methane reduction. But to what degree, what kind of mixture, all of that is still unknown, but we've got a terrific panel today to try to unpack all of that. So once again, I'm joined by Mark, Maria, Kevin, and Sarah. Thank you very much. Adam has done the introductions. I'm going to ask a question of all of them, have them weigh in, and then I've got targeted questions for each. We'll try to open it up to questions before we leave the stage promptly at 1:40 today. So that's our plan. I grabbed a folder just so I could have something for my questions. I looked at it. It says Beck Sing-Along, my son Beck. Beck Sing-Along, he wrote this when he was in grade 2. I have to leave right after this because he's got his graduation dinner from high school. Yes, thank you. He survived. We all survived too, I assume, if we're in this room. But I'm saying to our panel, it doesn't have to be a sing-along. We can disagree with each other. Okay, so thanks everyone. Let's get going. Here's the rapid-fire question, and why don't we just move on down the line? What work do you do to decarbonize Canada's energy sector?
Thanks for the question, Ed, and thanks everyone for listening to our panel. My name's Maria. I'm responsible for ESG at RBC and corporate lending. So I'm responsible for ensuring that the capital that we deploy through our corporate lending activity is used in a responsible manner. And one of the things that we do is, as we make new lending commitments, we look at each individual borrower's ESG strategy. And one of the things we're focused on as it relates to oil and gas in particular, and power and utilities, is ensuring that the companies where we extend capital have solid decarbonization plans in place. And we spend a lot of time talking to our clients, and I've talked to some of the people that are in the room today about the opportunities for decarbonizing the energy sector, the costs, the opportunities, the challenges, and there's a lot being done. And so when we extend capital to the oil and gas sector, our expectation is that those clients are doing what they can in terms of decarbonizing. So that's it in short for me.
Okay, thanks. Kevin, over to you.
Okay, I guess rapid fire. Kevin Krausert, CEO and co-founder of Avatar Innovations. We work inside oil and gas to unlock energy transition solutions and leaders for commercialization and scale. There's sort of three legs to that stool. The first is an ideation, almost venture studio space, where large cap oil and gas players place hundreds of employees to race across 12 weeks to generate energy transition solutions inside the industry. The best ones are selected for a technology co-development process at the University of Calgary and SAIT, where we go and build it. And then the third leg of the stool is we place early stage investments to get some of these pre-commercial technologies off the ground. We formed a partnership with the Elon Musk Foundation on his $100 million carbon removal X Prize and just opened up a 17,000 square foot energy transition center in downtown Calgary, supported by the large caps to house all of this. So in short, I guess we can't electrify everything. The most rational solutions for decarbonizing the other half of the emissions problem are things like hydrogen and biofuels and carbon capture, and these are things oil and gas is already doing very well. We provide a sandbox for us to try these, run faster, and put the oil and gas industry in the driver's seat of the energy transition.
And congrats on the Energy Transition Center at a time when people are wondering, what do we do with these white elephants, these downtown office space? You guys are opening a 17,000 square foot facility.
Yeah, we're full, and we're actually looking at the second floor plate now.
Okay, thanks. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Ed. Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Marshall, and I'm the Vice President of Sustainability at Nova Chemicals. You heard Luis earlier on talk a bit about the company. We are Canada's largest petrochemical company, and as such, we have a fair amount of emissions to abate. So in my role, I'm responsible for the decarbonization strategy of Nova Chemicals' petrochemicals operations. And what does that mean? It means I collaborate across the company. I like to come at it from a technical perspective with an engineering background, but we work across almost every function within the company right now to integrate our decarbonization roadmap. And we've made great progress over the years. We've reduced our emissions intensity 30% over the past 20 years. But as we know, reducing emissions intensity is not necessarily bending the curve to get you towards zero. So we believe we have about 20% more opportunity within the company around efficiencies, around flare reductions, around the things that companies can do that always save them money and save them greenhouse gases. But there's not that much low-hanging fruit left. And so we're really taking a look at the big moves and the bold moves that include new innovations on the longer term and what that pathway to 2030 looks like, particularly with some of the topics, Ed, that you mentioned earlier around hydrogen, carbon storage, for example. So looking forward to the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Mark.
So I'm Mark Cameron. I, as of 2 weeks ago, Vice President External Relations with the new Pathways Alliance, which we have called the Pathways Alliance because Oil Sands Pathways to Net Zero Alliance is too much of a mouthful. Plus, we joined with two other organizations that most people in this room will be familiar with, the Canadian Oil Sands Innovation Alliance and the Oil Sands Community Alliance. So these three organizations have come together to form the Pathways Alliance, which represents the 6 largest oil sands operators in Canada. That's Canadian Natural, Cenovus, ConocoPhillips Canada, Imperial, MEG, and Suncor, that collectively operate 95% of the oil sands production in Alberta and Canada. And we have a concrete plan to achieve 22 megatons of reductions per year by 2030 and a goal of achieving net zero by 2050 through a variety of new and emerging technologies. So for the last 5 months, I've been working flat out on this project, which continues to evolve at a really rapid pace.
It's evolving very rapidly, and Mark, I think I first met you, and it was great to see Ian and Jerry reminiscing today when you were in the Stephen Harper Prime Minister's office, when we thought they were going to have a national cap-and-trade system, and then a bunch of things hit, including East Anglia Gate, and the conversation changed. So how quickly things can change, but let's dig a little deeper into some of those specific pathways for the oil and gas sector to achieve the emissions reductions cut. What are those big pathways? What are the technology pathways in your mind? And let's have an honest conversation. Is the sector, it's You know, it's got to take on a 42% cut, something, let's split it between 40 to 45%. The federal government is asked to reduce its emissions by north of 80 megatons per year. That's a huge drop. And the government, some of its own officials came out very recently, the day we had coffee together in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago, saying, wow, this is really hard. So can you comment both of those on what are the major pathways, and can we actually, is there any way realistically that the sector can achieve that kind of cut?
Well, I'll agree that this is really hard. We have a clear plan for a 22 megaton reduction by 2030, which is roughly 30% of our own source emissions within the oil sands sector. It's hard to see what levers we can pull to go faster or further than that, but the plan to achieve that involves about 10 megatons per year of carbon capture and storage. It would involve 5 to 6 megatons a year of process improvements involving the use of solvents in some of our oil sands projects. It would involve greater energy efficiency. It would involve cogeneration. So there's a variety of technologies that we're looking to in the first decade. Then to actually get to net zero, you have to look at technologies that is not yet commercially available, such as direct air capture, small modular reactors, which we're involved in the discussion around those, potentially use of hydrogen as a fuel. It's already used in a lot of our facilities as part of the process, but actually using it as a fuel to replace natural gas. So these are some of the pathways that we'd be looking to in the 2030 to 2050 time period.
Great. And is it feasible? Can we get to that kind of cut?
It's feasible. I mean, it's not easy. It's expensive, but it is feasible. There is a technological path that will get us there.
Okay, fair enough. So Kevin, let's unpack one of those big pathways, and that is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Some of us here on the panel worked a lot very hard on that CCUS investment tax credit that became part of Budget 2022. I think we have the scars to show for it, and that we managed to make people upset on the left and on the right, which is maybe the hallmark of a good policy. I'd like to say, in an average day, you get, hopefully, in my old job, an average day, you get sniped equally at by the left and the right. But Kevin, tell us about CCUS. Like, to what degree is it going to be deployed?
I think it could be deployed on a pretty massive scale. Like, to Mark's point, a 42% reduction is feasible, but it's going to be complicated, messy, and hard. And we have to look at every single technology option that's going to be there, and we have to figure out how we're going to unlock the capital to be able to get there. So your investment tax credit, it's a very good start, but it's just the beginning. For an investor to start placing a 30-year bet on a multi-billion-dollar emerging technology, they're going to want investor certainty. And to Lisa Rate's point this morning, we've got to stop talking about carbon taxes and stop fighting about them. What is the structure that's going to enable investor certainty for us to be able to go and deploy these technologies? And I think that once investors see that sort of investment certainty, that we're not just going to change governments or change leaders every 4 years and change the structure around it, I think if you get that certainty, I think these projects are going to start going. But the piece of the puzzle that I think is most exciting on the carbon capture side is where some of these emerging technologies are actually going that fundamentally change the cost structure of carbon capture. Right now, when most of the major global projects were built, they were sort of predicated on a break-even of $70 carbon tax, which we're not at yet. But there are emerging technologies that allow us to be able to de-risk that Alberta can be in the driver's seat, that we can export to the world, that can bring the cost curve down dramatically. When we built the oil sands, there was this belief that it was high cost, high carbon. Well, we've just proven it's no longer high cost. We've gotten the lift cost down to some of the pristine assets to single digits. Now, this competes against the Saudis. And the reality is we have to do a lot of work on the carbon piece. But if the pathways work gets off the ground, we are in the driver's seat to change the cost curve of carbon emission or carbon capture technologies in the same way we did our lift costs in the oil sands, and we can export this technology to the world. Inside Avatar just alone, we've got probably 4 what I would call third-generation carbon capture technologies. This is a competitive advantage that Alberta can win, and you've got the oil sands, which are going to be this incredible customer for us to de-risk this technology and export it to the world. But it needs that investor certainty, and I'm certainly not a political person, but I would hope both political parties, or however many there are these days, would agree that this is too big of an opportunity for us to politicize.
Yeah. And, so we've got another question coming up around the hottest and latest new policy tool on the market, and that is a carbon contract for difference. The Mandarins in Ottawa say there's no one line in the emissions reduction plan back in March that's gotten more attention than that reference to a CCFD as an additional policy support. At the same time, they say, gosh, we built a stack of pancakes a meter high in terms of policy supports. Do we need yet another one? So we'll unpack that. But I want to go to Sarah. So Sarah, what are the prospects for petrochemical diversification in this province? I've been doing this for a while. There's the Emerson report, which is a great piece of work going back to like 2011, 2012, that talked about diversification. We've had the panel, the Lambert panel on innovation. We've got the natural gas strategy that's come out that would have us be one of the top 10 producers of petrochemicals and would expand and diversify our current portfolio. Tell us though, a lot of things have been done, a lot of ink has been spilled, and yet we still struggle with diversification. So where do we sit today?
Right. And what we're seeing in petrochemicals is not only a significant focus on decarbonization, but an even more significant focus from the plastics industry on the issue of plastic waste, and particularly plastic waste in the environment. So when we think about diversification in the petrochemicals segment, in the plastic segment of petrochemicals, we're thinking about both of these things and the intersectionality of the two of them. And what Alberta has done really well is in the natural gas strategy, they've brought in petrochemical diversification and they've brought in plastics recycling. When we think about plastics recycling and bringing those materials back into a circular economy, part of our work is focused on making those a feedstock for our operation. Now, in Alberta, we're the biggest ethane buyer. But imagine what will be the impact to Alberta as we're not only pulling that virgin fossil fuel into plastics, but we're also pulling in new recycled content feedstock, because that's really where the plastics industry downstream customers are focused. Give me that plastic feedstock. So Alberta's recognizing this, and they've incented and are moving towards extended producer responsibility legislation to bring plastics back into the economy, which is a great step forward along with many of the provinces in Canada. And at the same time, Alberta's also incentivizing the petrochemical industry's growth through the Alberta Petrochemical Incentive Program, which also is considering hydrogen in that program, and that's a 12% credit against your CapEx for the project, along with really participating well, as you mentioned earlier, in the consultation on CCUS ITCs. So when we look at the future of petrochemicals in Alberta, we're looking at it from the perspective of that dual approach. Where's the circular economy approach? Where's the decarbonization approach? And how do we bring those together into an integrated strategy? Because keep in mind, a lot of the same solutions that work for oil and gas decarbonization do work for the petrochemicals industry: hydrogen, CCUS, electrification, renewable energy and efficiencies. We talk about those, oil and gas talks about those. But 55% of our Scope 3 emissions in our company are from that feedstock. So it's really important that we consider both that recycled content and how that drops the carbon footprint and brings those materials back into the economy, as well as the decarbonization aspect. And I think Alberta's making good strides. Just to close out the comments, I was in Ontario last week, and it's not the same kind of support that the petrochemicals industry is seeing from the provincial government there as we are here in Alberta. And you're starting to see it through the growth and the project completions that are coming, whether that's IPL's PDH and PP plant, the new net zero cracker announcement in Alberta through a formidable competitor of ours. We're seeing things move forward. We're seeing more hydrogen projects come. And I think we always can count on more support from policy, given that we're going to need a higher carbon price to make some of these big moves happen. But it's a good start from Alberta's perspective.
Okay, great. Now, Maria, I purposely saved you for last. You're the banker
Right.
on this panel. So you've seen these
How do we pay?
flighty, excitable, tech-obsessed people with their grandiose plans, and they're saying, all it takes is more money and policy supports. So you sit there, you live this day to day. What is it going to take to get what Mark Carney will no doubt tell us will be billions or trillions of dollars sitting on the sidelines to actually invest in this, while also checking the necessary ESG boxes?
Right.
And I think I spoke to a colleague of yours last year, Greg Heath, and he said that energy transition will be the fastest growing vertical that we've seen since tech, since .com, and it's going to be more enduring. So, over to you.
Good question. So yes, I agree with Greg. I think that the energy transition is a huge opportunity. And I do think capital providers are looking to capitalize on the opportunities. But as Kevin pointed out, there's a lot of uncertainty still. And the technological risk, the uncertainty around government funding is there. So I think those things are challenges. I think part of the problem with decarbonization initiatives is they don't actually generate cash flow.
That's a big problem.
Yeah. And so, as Kevin mentioned, investors are looking for certainty, and they're looking for, some certainty. They're willing to take some risk. Equity investors in particular are willing to take some risk. Debt investors, not so much. You're looking for some level of certainty that, you're going to get repaid at the end of the day, or your investment is going to return. So I kind of think about it a little bit differently. I think that the way we're going is if a company does not have a decarbonization strategy or a decarbonization plan or initiatives, I think it's going to be incredibly challenging going forward for those companies to access capital. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just becoming table stakes in the energy industry in particular, where the bar is very, very high compared to some other industries. And the expectation from capital providers is that they are, focused on decarbonizing. They have strong ESG policies generally. So that's kind of how I think about it, is if you're not focused on this, you're just not going to have access to capital at all going forward.
And I know RBC has set aside capital with a higher risk tolerance, but at the same time, being good bankers, you need to know where you sit on that risk spectrum. And is it really a case of we do need more signals from government? Do we need more policy supports?
I think policy supports help. I mean, they can only go so far. Again, you get back to the issue of the cash flow. Because, if you think about something like CCUS, I mean, you're taking carbon out of the atmosphere, and there's, with carbon taxes, there's a cost that the company doesn't have to pay anymore because they captured the CO2, but there's no actual cash flow coming from it. But that isn't to say that capital providers aren't interested in funding carbon capture in conjunction with the main asset, right? Like if you're an oil sands producer, most of the big oil sands producers fund themselves corporately. They don't do project level financing on their oil sands projects. But if that was something someone wanted to do to add, to raise the money for the carbon capture, I do think something like that is possible. It's just not how these big oil sands companies are funding themselves right now.
Okay. Let's talk about one of the biggest policy supports out there, and that's carbon pricing, and let's talk about the future of it. I warned you, everyone, it's going to get wonky. Again, you've got about 30 minutes, but otherwise we're going to sit here, we're going to unpack carbon pricing and where it's going. So on one hand, we've got the federal government has set a price increase schedule going right up to $170 per ton by 2030. Yay. On the other hand, we've got a federal election that will happen at some point, 2025 perhaps, that could change that. We've also now provincially, we've got a review underway of Alberta's own industrial carbon pricing system, the TIER system, and its benchmarks and ultimately where it lands in terms of price. And then the last thing, just when you think you have all the policy supports needed to really get carbon capture projects happening, now we've got a concern around oversupply of compliance credits that will push the price of compliance credits down So you get your first 2 projects done, it's hard to get the nth projects done after that. So what is the future of carbon pricing? What do we need to do provincially, federally? That small question.
Easy one, eh?
Yeah, all right, go, Kevin.
I'll take the first stab at that because I see everyone actually jumping. So, you know, in terms of carbon pricing is a highly effective mechanism for incentivizing corporations to invest in the decarbonization technologies that are going to be required. And otherwise, they don't have a whole lot of incentives to be able to do it. Now, the nuance on what the right price is, should it be industrial tax versus a consumer tax, I don't think I'm not an expert on that, but what I will say is inside the investment decisions and the production costs and the cash flow modeling that the industry has done, the carbon tax is baked in. And the one thing investors hate is uncertainty. So if we're standing on this precipice where, you know, basically you've got, you know, billions, if not trillions of dollars worth of capital ready to jump, you've got the industry in a highly profitable position, you've got their investors telling them, okay, well, you know, if there's a conversation around either reducing costs or reducing emissions, it's a wasted conversation. You're starting to circle around, you know, pulling the pin on a pretty major decision. And so your contract for differences, I would see it as a very reasonable ask if I was going to go to the investment community and say, you know, we need $30 to $100 billion to invest in emissions reductions technologies. You need that guarantee. And so if you could do that contract for difference, you could go. Where it lands on the consumer side of things, I promise you, $120 oil is far more of a behavioral change that's going to impact people's energy decisions than, you know, a 5 cent on a liter carbon tax, right? So in this world of sort of energy scarcity, where we're choking supply and choking capital, you're going to have exploding prices. That's not what's going to incentivize behavioral shifts to decarbonize. The final piece of the puzzle is a carbon tax credit, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Mark, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I have a relatively high degree of confidence that the carbon price, the benchmark carbon price, will continue to go up to $170 a ton between now and 2030. But that in and of itself doesn't answer the question of whether these kinds of large projects are investable enough. I mean, there's a whole lot of questions to do with the rules, what percentage of emissions are subject to that price. If we have a surplus of credits, what market will we able to sell them on? What are the rules around it? I mean, we just saw yesterday with this draft final CFR reg that they said that the exports, CCS on projects for export would no longer be eligible for the clean fuel standard. So that's something that we had built into our economics, that we'd be able to count on that, and that's a rule change that has material difference on the viability of our projects. So what we really have to know is what is the certain price that we will be able to get. If we put a ton of carbon in the ground, what is the price that we'll be able to get, which is where the contracts for difference idea really is an important one, that we have to, regardless of changes in government or even changes of regulatory policy, you know, with it 2 or 3 times within the life of a government, that we have a guarantee that in 2030 and 2032 and 2035, there will be a price of X per ton that we can store.
Mm-hmm. So I do, before we move on, and we've sort of skirted around carbon contract for difference, we should define it and then talk about it and other policy supports. But you said you have a high degree of confidence that the price will go up to $170 per ton by 2030. So I'm not sure what leadership race, Conservative Party of Canada leadership race you're watching.
Yeah.
But the one I'm watching would not give me that confidence at all if we think that 2025, after 10 years and a government growing long in the tooth, we're likely to see a change in government.
I mean, on the consumer side, the carbon levy on gasoline, that could well change. But on industrial pricing, I mean, Alberta has had carbon pricing since 2007 under governments of all stripes. And I don't think that's likely to change in terms of the Alberta regulation of industrial carbon pricing. Mm-hmm. And I imagine that there'll be some sort of federal benchmark, even if there's a change of government. On the consumer side, I agree that's a completely open-ended question, and you know, that could well be the subject of future political changes.
Okay. All right, who wants to take a stab at defining what a carbon contract for difference is?
The banker?
The banker? or how about this? Okay. Carbon contract for difference, essentially the federal government enters into a contract with a strike price with a proponent of an industrial decarbonization project and says, okay, we'll basically backstop that price. So were there a change in that price schedule, and let's say the market price are actually $150 or $120 by 2030, using that as an example, it's supposed to be $170, then we will pay you the difference. And if for whatever reason the market price is above that, then the developer of the project pays the government money. Not unlike the contracts under our renewable electricity procurement program from the last government here in Alberta. So, Maria, if someone came to you, a developer of a project, and said, I have this contract with the government that's going to guarantee this price, and I won't be subject to the whims and fancies of the market price, and I'm getting 50 cents back on the dollar of the capture equipment, all the new equipment that I install in my cement plant, but I need your capital. Is that, I know it's a simplistic question, but is then that's going to,
No, it
you're going to
does.
open up the RBC spigots?
Well, it does make it easier, right? Because then all of a sudden you have some cash flow certainty, and it's not so different than in the U.S. They have those types of credit for renewable natural gas, and we're seeing a lot more renewable natural gas development there because there's the credits that they can then trade. So yeah, I mean, it does make financing more palatable when you have some cash flow certainty. Like, I mean, that's, as debt investors, that's what we look to.
Excellent. Yep, Sarah?
So from our perspective, I'd say write the rules, right? I mean, it's a great idea. It's something that I think as we look forward to Mark's earlier comments, we too see the likelihood that there will be an ongoing industrial carbon program across Canada, in Alberta, and in Ontario, where we operate as well. But we still, in Ontario, for example, under the emissions performance standard, don't know how compliance is going to work. They haven't actually released what those compliance credits will look like or not. And we're halfway through the year in the program. So when it comes down to what is our shareholder, what are we going to invest in from a Nova Chemicals perspective, we need to see those things come to fruition more quickly and understand with a little more certainty than we have today, given that every second year the tier program is under review. And does that mean we're going to be rebaselined as our facility? What's the new tightening rate? There's so much change that it does become challenging. It does become challenging to go back into the boardroom and describe once again, well, you know, last year it was this year it was this, to get things going.
And from my experience in talking to government, they really want to know setting investment tax rates, you know, what is it actually going to do to get, what do they have to do to get a decarbonization project through to final investment decision, to get that board approval. But on the same time, the argument against it is, wow, we've thrown everything and the kitchen sink into the mix. You have all these policy supports. You got national carbon price, clean fuel regulation. You have this target, that reg. And now, and an investment tax credit that gives you 50 cents back on every dollar you spend. And now you're asking us to enter into a binding contract with you that handcuffs the government through to 2030. And for them, what screams out, and I've had this conversation with finance officials, they say uncapped liability. And that's a very scary term for finance people. So what do you say in response to that when you have to go in and say, I know you've done a lot, but it's just not quite enough. Here's what we need in order to get these projects through to FID.
Well, if you want to get it done, that's how it's going to have to be done. That in a world of sort of certain volatility, and I think there's been some conversations this morning of just the sort of unprecedented disruption and the Black Swan event hiding around every corner. You know, it's energy security and it's energy transition. And to be able to navigate that piece, the role of public institutions has to be to clear out that uncertainty for us to be able to invest in these types of projects. You've already seen capital sort of retreating from, you know, the insane valuations of clean tech. You're seeing this, you know, clean tech bust almost 2.0 right now on the realization that investors are sort of retreating to their safety shores right now. So if we want to do this, and I think we should and we have to, and we want to win at this, this is going to require investment, collaboration, and technology on a scale we've never seen before. And the role of public institutions is to provide that, to allow that liquidity to unlock these trillions of dollars of capital sitting on the sideline that are a little squeamish right now. So, look at it from the opportunity lens, and that opportunity lens is the amount of capital that's going to get invested in this. Trillions, if not, McKinsey's new report, $180 trillion to get to net zero by 2050 globally. This is a staggering amount of capital, but it's also a staggering amount of investment. And if we want to win this race, we've got to figure out how we get this done. The Americans, they just put $3.5 billion into 4 direct air capture projects. Like, we can't even touch this type of investment in Canada. But what we can do is we can provide the certainty and the structures for investment to flow. I see that as a little bit of a false narrative. You can't, in one hand, hammer and the industry and the investors in trying to make these investments, and on the other side, not provide the framework where they can do it.
Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna use a Kevin Krausert trigger joke, because you talked about seizing the opportunity and winning. I joke to say, if the world were to transition away from wine, you wouldn't expect the French to lead that transition now, would you? So ultimately, and some say, I'm not saying, some say the transition is ultimately going to be away from oil and gas. So why would we expect Canada's largest producing province to lead that transition? What do you say? He's triggered. He's triggered.
That's a false narrative. It's not a transition off wine. If the world were to transition off of alcoholized wine, yes, I would expect France to be a global leader in it. And it's not a transition off oil and gas. It's a transition off of emissions. And that is when we can absolutely win. It's a false narrative to somehow suggest we're going from, and I really fear a world of de-alcoholized wine, but
maybe we're just decanting the wine. We're just decanting it in a more effective way.
But that's the point, is what else could we make with it? What is the other opportunity? I see it as a false premise. But at the same time, we can't rest on our laurels right now. We're all breathing a big sigh of relief with commodity prices where they are. But the reality is this is not the time for us to crack the champagne. A stunning fact that came to me around the challenge of Alberta's opportunity on this is, so Evoke Innovations is the sort of premier energy transition venture capital fund in Canada, sorry. Just closed a $300 million US round backed by Suncor, Cenovus, RBC, TD, CPP. Of the preliminary deals, the first 1,000 deals they've done preliminary due diligence on, 0 are from Alberta. Mm-hmm. This should raise alarm bells across us, that if we think that we're not going to, that clearly choking supply doesn't work, choking capital maybe does not work, it has to be technology. How do we, from a public policy perspective, think about how we incentivize these companies to invest in these emerging technologies so we can win this race? So we become the global leaders in de-alcoholized wine.
Yeah. To your point,
Go ahead, Mark.
To your point about if the world is transitioning away from oil and gas, why should we invest in this technological transformation of the industry? We don't know what the future will be for oil demand, but the premise that the industry is in decline and will be gone or next to gone by 2050 is, I think, a false one. I recently saw a projection that if all vehicles in the world were replaced by electric vehicles by 2040, given the growth of population in China and India and elsewhere, we'd still be at 90 million barrels a day of oil.
Yep.
And even if it's 40 or 50 million barrels a day of oil, as some of the more pessimistic projections show, or optimistic, depending on what side you're on, why wouldn't we want 10% or 15% of that market to be taken up by Canada? Why shouldn't we want Canada to be a larger provider, even if it's a smaller market, with the most ESG-friendly and responsible oil in the world, and especially if we can get it to net zero on the production side?
Sure. Yes.
Yeah, and I think we also have to think about the use cases for fossil fuels beyond fuel combustion, right? Coming back to the plastics conversation, that's a significant percentage of a barrel of oil and potentially may grow over time. As we look to what we talked about earlier in, I think it was Lisa Rate's panel around the discussion around the global population and where that's heading, how that impacts immigration in Canada was the topic there. But, we think about the rising middle class across the developing world. There's a tremendous, much higher than GDP growth forecast projected for plastic materials both in food preservation, in electric vehicles, and in many other applications. And although I talked earlier about the use of recycled feedstock, there's still a strong case for the use of NGLs and oil, and we want those materials to be decarbonized coming into our facilities. We want to run decarbonized facilities and produce the most sustainable plastic that the world sees. So that's a really important aspect for us, just in terms of, think about all the use cases for those materials and why we need to keep working together towards that decarbonization journey.
And Sarah, you alluded to the conundrum. The world is moving to 9 billion people by 2050. We want to lift all people out of poverty. We need to provide them affordable and clean energy, and that requires decarbonizing energy while increasing overall supply. And that's the challenge ahead of us, and obviously in Alberta, we're on the front lines of that. So we've got about 10 minutes left. Why don't we save those 10 minutes for questions from the audience? Yes, Gary up front. Gary Marr.
Let me say that Gary Marr from the Canada West Foundation. This has been a wonderful panel. We've got financing, we've got technology, we've got public policy all rolled into one. So my question is, having said that this is a great discussion, is this discussion happening in the Russian Federation? Is it happening in Venezuela? Is it happening in Saudi Arabia? Is it happening in the Middle East? And if it's not, all of this we've concluded will cost money to do. So how does our energy become competitive in a world where much of the world, I don't think, is having this conversation?
Yeah, and good point, Gary. We've figured out a way of pricing in carbon. How do we actually price in human rights? How do we price in transparency? How do we price in the respect of law? Panel, over to you.
I very much doubt they're having these conversations in Russia, but they are having them in Saudi Arabia. Argentina, a lot of OPEC countries. The Saudis, have invested massive amounts in technologies, and I would never underestimate Aramco in this race. How we win is by being the lowest cost and the lowest carbon. And so that's the thing that is, like Christina Lake, it's a Cenovus property. Its lift cost is now like $8 a barrel. Like, it is insane. That will be the last barrel out of the ground. All we now need to do is bolt on a bunch of carbon capture facilities, and we can go there. And then we can start having conversations about Scope 3 emissions. Are we using it for just oil, or are we using it for asphalt, or are we using it for petrochemicals? All those different things. We've gotten the cost curve down, and to a point we can compete against the Saudis. The next piece of the puzzle is carbon. It would be my short answer to that.
Yeah.
And so how do you incentivize that, Gary? I guess is what we're trying to get at.
On every metric except for emissions, Alberta and Canada are head and shoulders above anyone else, whether it's on labor, whether it's on Indigenous rights, whether it's on all the other environmental aspects of our operations. It's only on emissions because the oil sands is a very energy-intensive process. But if we can get that emissions down below the global average, then there's no reason why we shouldn't be a world leader. And Kevin is right. So, Saudi Arabia is fortunate; they have very low emissions intensity oil as it stands now. So, they're out there advertising literally on the helmets of F1 vehicles against our product. But if we can get our emissions down to that level, then we would be the world leader, because on every other metric we are by far. Maybe Norway will argue with us, but we're 1 or 2 on just about every other metric.
Yeah, and to put the banker on the spot, and you deal with the ESG crowd,
Right.
So how do we really price all those other non-carbon but equally important factors into the price of a barrel of oil?
Well, I actually think there is a marketing opportunity, and I don't think Canadian producers do a good enough job in terms of marketing themselves. People here internationally hear Canadian oil and they think oil sands, that it's dirty, right? We have to keep educating people that we don't call it tar sands in Canada when we talk to our European colleagues. But I think, there is a product now called responsibly sourced natural gas. There's some Canadian producers that have gotten their, responsible certification, and one of the things is that it's lower methane than, it has very, very high standards for methane emissions. And we're hearing from some of our clients in the US in particular that there are certain utility companies that will only buy responsibly sourced natural gas now. And Sarah made the point about Nova Chemicals wanting to purchase the lower carbon oil for your own production. Like there's a huge marketing opportunity to just make it clear to people, you know, how responsible Canadian oil is. So I think that's a big part of it.
Great. Let's go back to the floor. Another question. Yes, got a hand over there. Yeah, just shout. Use your big voice.
Is a race, and so how do we as business leaders help that alignment happen quicker? Because we have 3 carbon capture projects for 3 power plants, but I'm having a hard time telling investors what price to use.
Great.
So how do we get alignment between provincial, federal government?
And thank you, good sir. You actually must have seen the question I didn't get to in my question list here for our panel, and that's collaboration between the federal government and this provincial government here in Alberta. What more do we need to do around that alignment?
I'd say the industry has to align its aspirations with the aspirations of the general Canadian public. And that's going to require leadership at the provincial level, and it's also going to require leadership at the federal level. You know, I think that because the industry has, you know, rightfully felt that, you know, as, you know, the Permian was exploding, you know, the Canadian oil industry felt like it was, you know, being pushed down, that there's a lot of resentment that surrounds that. But that's not really a vision for the future of just holding onto a resentment. And, you know, Lisa from CAP this morning, you know, very much a collaborative approach around how do we align the aspirations of our industry with the aspirations of our public. You can't make the strategy of our industry that the public's aspirations are going to fail. And that's sort of what it sounds like. We have to look like we're a meaningful and powerful partner in the planet's climate ambitions. And I think we have a once-in-a-generational opportunity right now where we have these high oil prices to actually come out and look like the heroes. And say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to drive investment into these emerging technologies that we need while we responsibly deliver energy security to a planet being filled with some pretty bad actors. That, to me, is a message that I think you can sell outside this province. The challenge, I think, as we talked about, it's a little too easy to score cheap political points by pointing at some boogeyman. But, you know, if we want to build the Alberta I think everybody in this room wants to build, that's going to take some pretty big shoulders to say, you know what, we're charting on this path. We're gonna not pick fights. We're gonna be confident in our vision, and then we can get there. I don't know. That'd be my first answer to how we get.
I would say at both the federal and provincial level, there are pretty decent policy frameworks in place. At the provincial level, and we're dealing with both levels of government constantly. At the provincial level, they've got the tier program, they've got, you know, funding through ERA, we've got a royalty regime, we've got the pore space regulatory regime that we're currently in the process for bidding on pore space around Cold Lake. And so those pieces are all in place. At the federal level, you've got the investment tax credit, net zero accelerator, the clean fuel regulation. So those pieces are in place. But what there isn't is the integration, and there isn't really a always very constructive dialogue between those two levels of government. I mean, beyond the sort of political level potshots, which you'd expect, there needs to be a more substantive dialogue about how all those different pieces work together.
And maybe I just add into the conversation the element around collaboration on innovation for the future. I think, Mark, you made a lot of good comments. Kevin, you made a lot of good comments about how are we going to get ourselves to interim goals to 2030 and really push the accelerator down now. But there's a tremendous opportunity for continued innovation collaboration between the programs in the federal government and the provincial government. And we see some great support from Alberta. We see some strong support on the SR&ED tax credit from the feds, but I mean, Canada can be so much more powerful in this space with some more willpower from government collaboration.
So Maria, you talked about responsible natural gas. Before I left the Pembina Institute years ago, we did a project for Gaz Metro, the big LDC in Quebec, that asked us to do some research and come up with a definition and criteria for responsible natural gas. The person who was the matchmaker on that project between us and Gaz Metro, was Stephen Guilbeault. So if Stephen Guilbeault were in this room, and from your perspective as a banker, the Honourable Stephen Guilbeault is sitting where the Honourable Gary Marr is right now, what would you say to him in terms of that collaboration piece?
Well, I mean, I think just echoing what Sarah said, I mean, we have to collaborate, we have to work together. I mean, everyone's much stronger if we're just all on the same page, pushing in the same direction.
I think those are fitting words to end on. So thank you, panel. Let's give them a big round of applause. We're done. Next.
That was fantastic, so insightful. Ed, great job, and to all of our panelists, thank you so much. It's such an important part of the conversation. We're going to take a quick 5-minute break to reset the stage for our next keynote speaker, Mark Carney. Mr. Carney has worked with us every step of the way and through 3 COVID postponements, so stick around, don't go too far, as he's up next.